and welcome back to the program. I'm starting to see some very strong parallels with what's happening over in the UK right now and what happened at the Capitol building. They call it, if you Google January 6 USA, it comes up and says January 6 United States Capitol attack. I didn't see any people attacking. I just saw good people out there supporting their country, patriotic people. We've seen the iconic video footage of the man with the helmet on being escorted through the building as if he's on some sort of tour. It's absolutely unbelievable. Some of the sentences that people got because of that. Some people got multi-decade sentences who weren't even there. They were charged with causing others to go there. The whole thing is a complete nonsense. I pray that should Donald J. Trump be elected for a second term, that pardons are issued across the board. I would assume that will be the case, but I certainly hope. Our next guest, Timothy Hale, was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and weapons contractor for the U.S. Navy. He was arrested for peacefully protesting at the Capitol on January 6 and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. He's now free and he's speaking out about the true story of what happened on that fateful day on January 6, 2021. Timothy, welcome to the program.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you.
Mate, all I can say, I mean, as an Aussie, I'm just so sorry as to what happened to you. I cannot begin to imagine, and even when I try, I get angry at just how nonsensical this whole thing was. The fact that it was all based on total lies. Everything that you would have advocated for in your defense was provable on video. There was no attack. There was no insurrection. And these imbeciles in the mainstream media and in politics who perpetuate that lie, I mean, it's bad enough for me just to talk about it. For someone who was sentenced, I mean, I can't even imagine how angry you must have been. I can't even imagine.
You know, it's one thing I always go back to is like we have a common bond. I think Australians, Americans, even British, New Zealand. Those of us in the Anglosphere, we come from the common law tradition, and so liberty has always been the norm, and the kind of tyranny we've seen in the last few decades has really been an exception, but I feel like it's going to start becoming the norm. I would say that one of the things that we always used to have protections for civil liberties and stuff, but one thing we're finding in the U.S., and I think it's true pretty much everywhere around the world now, is that these things that we hold sacred in our lives are being trampled on, and now we're going into an age where I'd say maybe a third of the population of all of our countries are being targeted for entrapment. You're absolutely right. Most people that day were not violent at all. Most people who walked onto the premises didn't even know it was a restricted area because there were barriers that were knocked over. There were no signs that said trespassing or restricted area. And this is an unfortunate thing, or it's an uncomfortable thing to address, those of us in this sphere. But the truth is that like in many such cases, I think that the federal government entrapped a lot of people, set them up for a narrative, and of course, the press works arm in arm with the government, and so I think that we've just been victims of a propaganda campaign for the last several years. You're absolutely right. The CCTV, the video that they're withholding from the public shows people were walking around inside the Capitol like it was a tour, like it was a museum. And that's essentially what happened. And that was true for myself as well. You can see us taking pictures, selfies with statues in the crypt. So it's all been manipulated for narrative purposes. You know how the press works. And, they played the same 30-second clips of, say, one person breaking a window for 3 years to obfuscate the true depth of what actually happened that day. If you look at a lot of the groups that they framed as extremists, like the Proud Boys of the Oath Keepers, then you know that there were federal informants who were planted in there to infiltrate and set people up. It was completely unfair. They raked them through the coals. And so people were completely set up. Their lives were destroyed. Their names were smeared. And it's going to happen in all of our countries. And I think it already is. Well, I've missed a bit while I was locked up. I've missed a bit, but I'm pretty sure it's happening everywhere now. It's a horrible precedent. So I'm sorry for that too.
How long did you actually spend behind bars as a result before you were let out?
Well, fortunately, President Trump signed the First Step Act, which reformed the justice system a little bit. So I only had to do 3 years on my 4-year sentence. So I did a year in solitary confinement. I did 16 months before I even got a trial.
Confinement.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I couldn't get a speedy trial. It took me a year and a half. And so I spent 2 years in what they called the DC gulag. And then once I was finally sentenced, after I'd already done basically half my sentence anyway. Then I finally went to federal prison where I spent about a year on Fort Dix.
What
So that was fun.
what justification did they have to put you in solitary confinement for a year? I can't even believe they did that. Wow.
And well, keep in mind, this is coming out of the COVID era. So for some of the more extreme elements of the country, Washington, D.C., the federal capital of the United States, is like pretty much it's pretty much like every hardcore democratic state where they had extreme lockdown policies, extreme COVID policies. So they were able to use COVID as a Trojan horse to deprive us of civil liberties. So we couldn't get religious services, we couldn't see our lawyers, we couldn't get our evidence. We couldn't even go outside for fresh air or sunlight. We couldn't see our families. We were actually lied to routinely, promised that if we got the COVID shot, then we could see our families, which is a lie. That we could have religious services if we got COVID shots, which was also a lie. Several people fell for that. They listened to people's phone calls. Attorney-client privilege didn't exist. There were a lot of violations. Pretty much everything in what Americans would call the Bill of Rights that enshrine our constitutional liberties, all that was stripped. And we were pre-trial detainees, so we were not convicts yet. So everything that American citizens should value in terms of liberty was completely stripped of us because COVID. And then they continued doing that after even after Washington, D.C. wasn't following those COVID protocols, the jail was. So there was basically there was no relief there for at least I would say about a year and a half. So that was fun.
When you were in prison, did you have any other, I'm going to call them January 6 patriots? Did you have any others who were in there with you at the time?
When I was initially locked up, yes. So in the gulag, they actually put an entire wing of the DC jail just for January 6 defendants. So they basically kept us all locked up in there like we were terrorists in Guantanamo Bay. So they kept us cordoned off, and basically they wanted to isolate us in order to pressure us into taking plea deals, which is ironic because if we ever questioned the oppressive system they had, then they would just threaten to send us into the general population area to get stabbed by the locals. Though I don't think most of us were scared of that. I think most of us wanted to go in the general population because we would have had more freedom. But that's neither here nor there. It's just a demonstration of the psyop that it was a constant psychological warfare thing they were doing to us. It was like a psyop within a psyop. So very uncomfortable.
Were people who were imprisoned for the same thing that you were you treated any better, and I would hope you were, than most of the other prisoners, knowing full well the guards should have known full well that you actually hadn't committed a crime?
No, we were treated worse because initially, keep in mind, Washington, D.C.'s jail system is horrible and it should be reformed, but a lot of people who are in there, for what it's worth, treat the cops horribly. So they'll create, we'll just say human cocktails and squirt them out of bottles at the police. But yet we were treated essentially as white supremacists, neo-Nazis, terrorists, and what have you. They would call these things to our face, the officers. And so it's important to understand the narratives. If you Google any of our names, those are the narratives that are going to come up about us. They frame this stuff, one, to justify our treatment incarcerated, also to prejudice juries against us so we could never get a fair jury. And DC is biased as it is about Trump supporters. But after January 6th, that was like there was no way you were going to get a fair trial in DC. And then they did everything they could to smear our names. And keep in mind also, there is a human element here. A lot of these guards were locals. So they took January 6th very personally. And so some of them did warm up to us. I want to be fair to them too, but for the most part, they treated us like absolute human refuse. They hated us, and they let us know it every single day. They despised us.
I mean, I've gone on about it God knows how many times. I mean, I literally lost $14,000 placing a bet on Donald Trump to win the last election. Anyone with half a brain knows that was rigged. It was absolutely rigged as a result of these bastards who rigged it. It's fair to say, had that vote not been rigged and Donald Trump had a second term, you would never, ever have spent a day in prison.
Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely rigged. You should have won that bet. I went there dressed like this. I was there in a suit and tie. Like I went to Men's Warehouse the night before to get new dress shoes. Like I was just there for a speech. Most people there, and this is on my video that I released from my phone. And this is the video, like the kind of video they don't show on TV. On my phone, we're listening to Trump's speech, and you can hear someone behind me saying there's some kind of a march going on, because people didn't know there was going to be a protest at the Capitol. And so, there were a lot of elements there that were like totally random. So on the one hand, they want you to believe that this was a pre-planned insurrection that was coordinated, it was planned, it was a seditious conspiracy. But on the other hand, they want you to think that people just immediately went to the Capitol because Trump told them to attack it, which never happened, of course. So there's this weird dichotomy where they want you to think this was a pre-planned insurrection, but also as a spur of the moment, people just obediently listened to a direction from Trump to attack the Capitol. And it's like the truth is that there were some elements there for the wrong reasons. There were people planted in the crowd to instigate and incite things, sure, but that's not representative of most people there. And most people just randomly went there to chant USA and sing God Bless America at the Capitol. And that's on my phone. You can watch it on the video. And so like we didn't even know that there was anything happening there. We didn't know there was anything wrong with us being there because, again, some people tore down signs and tore down barriers. So thousands of us just poured into essentially a trap. Trump didn't do anything wrong. Trump said to peacefully protest. He didn't make anybody break anything or attack cops. There was a lot that would happen in that time frame, and they're covering it up essentially. And there were feds, there were Antifa, there were a lot of agitators there planted in the crowd. And so people need to realize there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. It was a setup.
I mean, you mentioned Antifa. You watch them. I mean, they should be considered a terrorist group. BLM, the BLM riots and whatnot. And those people, nothing happens. Nothing ever happens to them en masse. And here are a bunch of strong patriot people going out, being patriotic, and just being punished. Are you seeing? I'm feeling that there are some strong parallels with what's happening over in the UK at the moment, where there's this two-tier level of justice where they seem to be going after these British patriots who were, they were rioting. Not that there was any riot at the Capitol building, in my opinion, but over in England, there are some patriots. I don't know whether you're aware of what's happening over there. Some children were killed and a bunch of others stabbed. And some members of a particular community had had enough of mass immigration. They went out there, they protested, things got out of hand. The counter group of Islamic faith came out, and of course the police letting them do whatever they like, but targeting and inviting people to dob in their friends and neighbours of the other group. I'm just seeing some strong parallels where one group is treated so very differently than the other for doing the same thing.
One thing I've really latched onto since becoming a defendant and having to research case law and stuff like that. This doesn't really apply to the UK or Australia, but in the US, we have what's called equal protection. And so this is a principle under the 14th Amendment. It originally was for protecting slave or ex-slaves after the Civil War, but the principle is that religious, ethnic, and even political dissident status does not change how one should be treated in the eyes of the law. And so you're right to notice Antifa, Black Lives Matter, Code Pink, many other groups in the US, for instance, have interrupted congressional proceedings or they've attacked federal property, like out in Portland where they attacked a federal courthouse. And they've been treated very differently than Trump supporters on January 6th. And so, without being an expert on any other country's system, what I would say is that it does seem to be the case that any movement loosely affiliated with the right, let's say, is treated much harsher than those who are, let's say, of the leftist persuasion or even anarchists or what have you. People who want to tear down society tend to be the ones who are kind of given a slap on the wrist, but the people who want to preserve society and uphold the civilization they love, they tend to be the ones who are grinding under the heel. And so, I without knowing every specific thing about what's happening in the UK, I wouldn't be surprised that throughout, let's say, the civilized world, we start to see people being targeted more and more because they're willing to stand up and voice their opinions about what they love versus the people who only want to use their rights to tear everything down. It wouldn't surprise me at all. Not at all.
How long after January 6th did you get what I'm assuming was a knock on the door?
I was actually arrested 1 week after. I was the union representative for, and this is how far right I am. I was the union leader. I was the union rep for the weapons contractors that worked on the Navy base I lived on. And so my employer, management, hated me because I was so union. They actually snitched on me to NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service of the Navy. NCIS and the FBI had my roommate wear a wire. so they could try to incriminate me. 1 week after January 6th, I'm going to the pet store and I get pulled over, and they just all these vehicles pull over, all these people in armored tactical gear, rifles in my face. Yeah, so I got it pretty quick. I was part of what they called the shock and awe campaign after January 6th.
I'm sure
And then
sorry, go on.
I was going to say, like, right after the, and this is the funny thing. A lot of us who were picked up initially, we were just given like misdemeanors, like trespassing, but they went through all that trouble to catch us. Immediately after the inauguration, when Biden took office, that's when I got indicted. That's when a lot of people started getting these charges called obstruction of an official proceeding, which is some statute that goes back to the Enron scandal, has nothing to do with rioting. It has to do with tampering with documents. But they used this charge for the last 3 years before the Supreme Court just overruled it a couple of weeks ago. They were using that to give people insane sentences. You can get up to 20 years in prison for that obstruction charge. And that's why they used it, because otherwise the most you could give someone was like, what, 5 years? But that and the seditious conspiracy charge are why people like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers have gotten such extreme sentences. So they've weaponized the law, literally the statutes that can't even apply under our system. And keep in mind, yeah, I'm glad that the system has worked in that sense. I'm glad that the Supreme Court ruled favorably for January 6th. I already served my sentence. That was the one felony I had. I already served my sentence on that. You got people who've had to spend years in prison and thousands of dollars fighting against a charge that's completely illegitimate. I mean, and they don't care. They're never going to get an apology. I just got a letter recently saying that the feds are going to put a lien on my property, even though I've never missed one payment for restitution. They don't care. They're never, I was expecting an apology letter. I mean, I wasn't really, but but that's never going to happen. And that's the point. They don't care. Nobody even believes in January 6th in this country anymore. Nobody even believes in that. And so it's just like, but they don't care. They're not going to stop. They're saying they're going to arrest 1,000 more people before this election's over. So they just do not care. I
hate to say it, but I think it's a sign of things to come. Tim, I'm just so sorry that happened to you, mate, and I'm glad that you're well and that you're out, that you're free to go about and continue with your life. And again, mate, I think all of us watching or listening, we feel for you. You were so badly treated, but mate, have a terrific life, and I hope things are looking up.
Well, thank you very much.
Tim Hale, everybody, someone who was absolutely done over by the system, and the American government has a lot to answer for. We're going to be back after the break with Rod Roberts and Bao Hun.